Why didn't you tell me I was being abused? That's what I asked my therapist almost exactly 20 years ago. I'd gone to therapy because my husband wouldn't go to marriage counseling with me, and like a lot of high achievers, I thought maybe if I just fixed myself, the marriage would get better. I wasn't a therapist yet. I wasn't studying trauma, and I certainly didn't think of myself as someone with PTSD. In my mind, trauma belonged to combat veterans, catastrophic events, other people, not me. At that point, I had been married for almost 13 years. And looking back, I can see that much of what I experienced was chronic rather than acute. Patterns of antagonism, coercive control, walking on eggshells, hypervigilance for sure. All of that became my normal, but I couldn't see it while I was living inside of it. And 20 years later, I'm still occasionally surprised by memories, triggers, even the absence of some periods of time and memories. So this is one reason I care so much about this topic. June is PTSD Awareness Month. And before some of you decide this video isn't for you because you aren't a combat veteran or because you don't think you've experienced trauma, I invite and encourage you to stay with me, because many of the professionals I work with don't recognize themselves in the word trauma. They recognize themselves in anxiety, perfectionism, overfunctioning, people-pleasing, insomnia, anger, burnout, other unhealthy coping, alcohol. In fact, one of the things I hear most often from smart, successful people is, Dr. Joe, I understand why I drink. I know where it comes from. I've read the books. I've been to therapy. I have insight. So why do I still get stuck? And the answer surprises people, because insight and healing are not synonymous. Understanding trauma doesn't automatically regulate a nervous system. And that's what we're talking about today, because trauma isn't weakness. Trauma is adaptation. And some of the very qualities that helped you become successful may have begun as survival skills. Hypervigilance, self-reliance, perfectionism, responsibility, persistence, achievement. These qualities may have helped you build a career, but they also leave your nervous system exhausted. One of my favorite clinical sayings is this: everything psychological is biological. When the brain experiences overwhelming stress, the amygdala becomes more reactive. The HPA axis becomes overactive. Cortisol stays elevated. The nervous system learns hypervigilance. The prefrontal cortex loses efficiency. Reward pathways become altered. The result? People become very good at surviving, but not necessarily very good at resting, not necessarily very good at joy, not necessarily very good at feeling safe. And that's where alcohol makes perfect sense, at least initially. It quiets anxiety. It slows the racing thoughts. It turns down the volume of hyperarousal. It creates relief. And the brain pays attention to relief. The brain records, remember this. We may need this again. That's conditioning. That's neuroscience, not character. One of the 6 pathways into addiction and unhealthy coping that I've written and taught about for years is trauma. Another is co-occurring disorders. Another is conditioning. And here's something I think is important. Trauma shows up at least twice, because trauma itself can predispose someone to addiction. And the consequence of trauma can create additional vulnerabilities. PTSD, anxiety, depression, ADHD, sleep disorders, Burnout, chronic stress. In other words, trauma may be pathway number 1, and the conditions that grow out of trauma may become pathway number 2. Because trauma doesn't just happen to a person. Trauma happens inside a nervous system. And over time, that dysregulation becomes much more than emotions. Remember, everything psychological is biological. It affects sleep, immune function, inflammation, hormones, appetite, metabolism, pain, energy, relationships, pleasure, even the body's ability to feel safe. I'm convinced that trauma influenced my own hypervigilance and years of chronically dysregulated sleep. And while we can't say for certain, I've often wondered whether decades of elevated cortisol, chronic stress, and a nervous system that spent far too much time preparing for danger contributed to my weight, my eventual diagnosis of Crohn's disease, and some other physical consequences that emerged later in my life. Because trauma doesn't just leave fingerprints on our memories, it leaves fingerprints on our bodies. And that's one reason I get concerned when people oversimplify addiction, because many professionals aren't dealing with one issue. They're dealing with layers. Trauma, anxiety, insomnia, perfectionism, burnout, several forms of unhealthy coping, such as workaholism, compulsive productivity, anger. At first, the substance or behavior looks like the problem, but often it began as a solution. And that's why integrated treatment matters, because if we only treat the alcohol and ignore the nervous system underneath, we're asking people to give up one of the only tools their brain has learned to trust. And that rarely works for very long. I think about this a lot because I was already sober when I began understanding the impact trauma had on my own nervous system. Sobriety didn't eliminate the need for healing. It simply made the adaptations easier to see. People think they're getting worse. They're not. They're simply seeing what alcohol had been covering. The nervous system still wants regulation. It's just looking elsewhere. And this is one reason high achievers are particularly vulnerable, because many of the traits that create success, vigilance, responsibility, persistence, self-reliance, problem solving, perfectionism, are adaptations. Sometimes competence becomes camouflage. And I want to tell you something else that surprised me. I was already sober when I began to understand the impact trauma had on my nervous system. Recovery didn't eliminate the need for healing. Sobriety didn't magically resolve the adaptations. It just made them easier to see, which is why I've spent years saying sustainable recovery isn't just about abstinence. It's about architecture. It's about helping the brain and nervous system learn something new. New relationships, new coping tools, new experiences, new patterns, new wiring. Because trauma survivors aren't broken. They are adaptive. But surviving and thriving are not the same thing. And I spent years asking, what's wrong with me? It turns out the better question was, what happened to my nervous system? And what has it been trying to do for me all these years? Because recovery isn't about becoming someone else. It's about helping the nervous system finally learn that the danger has passed. And that's why sustainable recovery is never built on willpower. It's built through architecture. I'm Dr. Joe, and this is Sober in the C-Suite. I help professionals understand stress, build better coping tools, and enjoy life without alcohol.